The wind cut across the valley like a silver blade, carrying the scent of frozen earth and the faint smoke of distant cabins. Snow lay thick upon the hills, glimmering under a pale winter sun that struggled to climb through the gray. In the smallest cabin of Dry Hollow, a woman sat by a dying fire, her hands pressed to the thin quilt draped across her lap. Her name was Maybelle Carter, widow of a man who had promised her a lifetime of laughter and had left her instead to the quiet ache of loneliness. Her eyes traced the outline of the cabin, from the bare floorboards scarred by years of toil to the walls where her husband's tools still hung. Everything around her spoke of absence. Even the wind seemed to whisper his name. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a relentless shadow that refused to leave. She had sold everything she could, piece by piece, until the last item of value remained. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had circled her finger through decades of joy and sorrow. Now, it rested in a small velvet box on the wooden counter of Harlan's general store, exchanging its quiet shine for a few meager coins and a sack of flour. As Maybelle stepped back into the cold, the biting wind met her like an old adversary, tugging at the thin shawl around her shoulders. Each breath formed clouds of white that dissipated quickly into the gray air. She walked past empty storefronts and shuttered windows, her boots crunching over frozen mud. People averted their eyes as she passed. A widow in Dry Hollow drew attention not for herself, but for what she had lost. Yet she held her head high. Pride, stubborn and stubbornly human, kept her from succumbing entirely to despair. She whispered under her breath, words only the wind could hear. He would have wanted me to eat, to live. Her voice trembled, fragile yet defiant. The valley lay silent except for the rustle of the trees, the low groan of the wind, and the distant bark of a lonely dog. Maybelle paused, looking toward the ridge where the sun struggled to light the hills. Somewhere out there, beyond the frost and the frozen creek, a life still waited. She did not know if it would be hers, but she believed in the possibility. For now, all she could do was keep walking, keep breathing, keep living. Each step over the frozen earth was a quiet promise, a fragile vow to survive until help, or hope, found her. And unknown to her, someone did watch. A man rode along the distant ridge, tall and wide-shouldered, his hat pulled low against the wind, a coat heavy with dust and memory. He was a rancher, a solitary figure moving through the winter landscape, unaware yet that his path and hers would soon converge in a story neither would forget. The snow fell heavier as night approached, but Maybelle kept moving forward, her heart a fragile ember against the winter chill. Somewhere in the dark, a chance for salvation stirred on the horizon, waiting for the right moment to enter her life. Night fell over Dry Hollow like a velvet curtain, heavy with the hush of snow-laden trees and the distant cry of an owl. The wind still cut through the valley, sharper now, carrying the taste of frost and the faint scent of pine resin. In her small cabin, Maybelle Carter sat near the dim glow of the hearth, stirring a thin broth that barely promised sustenance. The fire sputtered and hissed, as if it too were reluctant to endure the cold, but she coaxed it along, letting the warmth lap against her hands in small, desperate doses. She had lived long enough to know the quiet ache of survival, the loneliness of nights spent listening to shadows, and the bitter weight of poverty that pressed like a stone on her chest. The memory of her husband lingered in every creaking board and faded curtain. Sometimes, in the hush of midnight, she imagined his voice whispering encouragement, urging her to endure, to go on. But those were moments of mercy, fleeting and fragile. A knock at the door startled her. Heart-hammering, she rose slowly, her hand brushing against the quilt that had offered so little warmth tonight. "Who's there?" she called, her voice thin but steady. No answer came, only the wind's mournful whistle replied, stirring the embers of the fire into brighter sparks. She took a deep breath and opened the door a fraction. Snow fell in soft clumps onto the porch, leaving the night still and silent. At first, she saw nothing, only the shadows cast by the flickering lantern in the cabin behind her. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a coat dusted with travel and memory. He did not speak immediately, letting the silence stretch like a rope between them. "I'm sorry to trouble you," he said finally, his voice low, carrying the faint rasp of wind against mountains and plains. "I was passing through and saw your light. Thought I might offer some company." Maybelle hesitated. Stranger in the night, a man from the ridge, a shadow of the valley itself. Yet there was no menace in his presence, only a calm, quiet weight, as though he belonged to the land and not to the cruelty of men. I have little to offer," she said, voice trembling with the honesty of years spent scraping by. "No food, no fire, and no warmth beyond this hearth." He smiled faintly, though his eyes were dark, thoughtful, and almost sad. "Then we'll make do with what we have," he said. He removed his gloves, revealing hands that were broad but careful, a workman's hands softened by thought. He stepped into the cabin, the door closing behind him, and the wind's howling seemed to lessen. They sat near the fire, speaking little at first, letting the warmth fill the room, letting presence replace loneliness. There was no sudden magic, no instant relief, only the quiet assurance that someone else had arrived, someone who could see, without judgment, the burden she carried. And as the snow continued to fall beyond the window, blanketing the valley in silence, Maybelle realized something she hadn't felt in years. She was not entirely alone. Perhaps, in the quiet turn of fate, hope had come riding into Dry Hollow that night, as soft and deliberate as the falling snow. Somewhere on the ridge, the rancher watched over the valley, unaware yet that a small act, a glance, a presence, a shared warmth, was beginning to weave their lives together. In the cold of the western night, amidst the ache of loss and the hunger of the heart, two lonely souls had found the first ember of connection, fragile but persistent. Morning crept over Dry Hollow like a hesitant visitor, brushing pale light across frost-covered fields and wooden rooftops. The wind had softened overnight, leaving only the soft hiss of melting snow and the occasional crow's distant call. Inside her cabin, Maybelle Carter awoke to the quiet, stillness heavy as a thought she could not name. The fire from last night was reduced to smoldering coals, and she stirred them with a poker, coaxing life back into warmth. Across the room, the table held the few provisions she had purchased with the last coins from her wedding ring. Flour, beans, a small chunk of salted meat, a meager bounty that would keep her alive another few days. She touched the sleeve of her dress, threadbare and patched, and for a moment felt the weight of her solitude press against her. Her eyes drifted to the small velvet box on the counter, the place where the ring had rested just a day before. Now it was gone, replaced only by the memory of its soft gold gleam, the promise it had carried for decades. She remembered how it had slid onto her finger on a spring morning, her husband's voice soft, words of forever whispered into the breeze. The absence of that ring was more than a loss of metal, it was a tangible ache, a symbol of survival traded for necessity. She clenched her fists, letting herself feel the sting of shame, the humiliation that came with every step she took in this lonely valley. Yet, she forced herself to rise. There was work to be done, chores, small tasks that kept life tethered to her fingers. The cabin required wood, the animals demanded attention, and the snow outside threatened to make each step a battle. As she gathered herself, a distant sound reached her ears, the rhythmic crunch of hooves across the frozen earth. Her heart skipped. In Dry Hollow, visitors were rare, and a rider in the snow was rarer still. She peered through the frost-lined window and saw him, the rancher. Thomas Reddick, broad-shouldered, dust and frost clinging to his coat, riding slowly toward the cabin. There was no hurry in his movement, only purpose, measured and steady, as if he were aware of the weight carried within the walls of her home. When he dismounted, snow crunching beneath heavy boots, she felt a flutter she had long forgotten. Not fear nor shame, but a quiet curiosity, tempered by the cautious hope that some good might still exist in the world. He approached the cabin, removed his hat, and held it in his hands as though presenting himself in humility. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he said, voice low but certain. "I believe this belongs to you." From his coat pocket, he produced the small velvet box, worn at the edges, the gold glinting faintly as the morning sun caught it. Her hands trembled as she stepped forward, the chill forgotten in the sudden warmth of wonder. You bought it back?" she whispered, disbelief trembling in her tone. "I did," he said simply. "It's yours, and it always should have been. Some things aren't meant to be sold, even for hunger." Her eyes filled with tears, not for pride, but for relief, for the quiet miracle of recognition. In that moment, the cold of winter, the ache of loneliness, and the shame of necessity were held at bay by a simple act of kindness. And for the first time in years, Maybelle Carter allowed herself to breathe freely. Perhaps, she thought, there were still miracles to be found in Dry Hollow, and perhaps hope could ride in on a man's quiet strength, as steady and certain as the snow melting under the morning sun. The day unfolded slowly in Dry Hollow, the snow glinting like scattered diamonds under the pale winter sun. Maybelle Carter sat near her hearth, the gold band on her finger a steady warmth against her cold skin. She traced it with a fingertip, marveling at its quiet resilience, a reminder that even in the harshest winters, some things endure. Thomas Reddick remained in the cabin, a rare guest in her long, lonely years. He moved with measured care, lighting a fire in the stove, checking the woodpile, doing small acts that spoke louder than any words. Maybelle watched him from across the room, noticing the careful way he handled each task, the way his gaze lingered on the practicalities of life as if they were sacred rituals. Finally, she spoke, her voice cautious, hesitant. Why would a man like you stop for someone like me? A stranger, a widow, nothing to offer but a cold fire and empty shelves." He looked up from stacking wood, his eyes meeting hers, dark and steady. "Because some debts aren't counted in gold," he said. "Some things are worth more than coins. Some people are worth more than pride or hunger." Maybelle's heart stammered, unfamiliar with words so gentle and sure. She had known struggle, she had known the cold bite of loneliness, the shame of trading pieces of herself for survival. And yet here he was, a man of strength and silence, offering more than assistance, offering dignity, acknowledgement, a small bridge across the chasm of her despair. She hesitated, then nodded. Thank you, sir." He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Don't thank me, not yet. There's more to this world than a coin's worth of flour or a gold ring. But a man who sees someone in need, he makes his choice. That's the bargain." She didn't understand immediately, but she felt it, the weight of his words, the quiet gravity beneath them. He did not offer pity, nor did he demand gratitude. He offered presence, a shared endurance of hardship, a recognition of her value beyond circumstance. The snow continued to fall outside, a soft, relentless whisper across the valley. Maybelle felt something shift within her. The ache of hunger, the fatigue of years spent alone, the relentless pressure of survival, all were still present, yet softened by the knowledge that someone had chosen her. Not out of obligation, not for gain, but because it was the right thing to do. Thomas Reddick moved closer then, carefully setting a bundle of provisions on the table. "Flour, beans, dried meat, enough to last a week," he said. No words of judgment, no reminder of the cost she had paid. Only quiet acknowledgement that she deserved to survive, to breathe, to hope. Maybelle's eyes brimmed with tears, but they were not the tears of despair. They were tentative, fragile, the first droplets of trust, of tentative connection. In that quiet cabin, amidst the crackling of the fire and the soft rhythm of snow against the windows, a slow understanding took root. Kindness, when given freely, has the power to ignite hope even in the coldest winter. And as the day wore on, she found herself smiling softly, not from relief alone, but from the subtle realization that the valley, the snow, the wind, even the hardships, might not be so unbearable if someone like Thomas Reddick chose to stand beside her. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of warmth in her chest, a small ember of possibility. And somewhere deep within, she dared to imagine that survival was not the only promise the future might hold. The sun had dipped low behind the western ridge, casting long, amber shadows across the frozen valley. Inside her cabin, Maybelle Carter stirred the pot of broth with a careful hand, the aroma faint but comforting. The warmth of the fire licked her cheeks, bringing color back to skin that had grown pale from months of hunger and worry. Yet it was not the fire that made her heart stir. It was the presence of Thomas Reddick, sitting quietly across the room, his eyes observing the rhythm of her movements, steady and uninstructive. They had spoken little that day. Words had seemed unnecessary. Each glance, each small motion carried the weight of understanding and connection. The simple act of sharing space became their conversation, a dialogue of survival and recognition, a delicate dance neither wanted to disrupt. Thomas rose then, moving to the hearth to stoke the coals. The sparks rose and fell, briefly illuminating his face, strong, weathered, yet softened by the light of the fire. Maybelle watched him, her gaze lingering on the careful precision of his movements, the quiet attention he paid to the small details of her life. There was a patience there, a measured kindness that seemed rare in a world so often cruel. "You've done well keeping this place together," he said quietly, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. "A lot of people would have given up long ago." Her hands stilled on the spoon, and she turned to face him. "I've had little choice," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I can't afford to fail. There's nothing left if I do." He met her gaze steadily. "Sometimes it isn't about what's left. Sometimes it's about what you do with what's here." His hand gestured subtly to the modest cabin, the food on the table, the fire burning in defiance of the cold. "You've made a life out of nothing. That counts for more than gold or land ever could." Maybelle felt warmth rising within her chest, not just from the fire, but from the weight of his words. For years, she had carried the burden of survival alone, believing that her efforts were unnoticed, insignificant. And yet here was a man who saw it all, not with pity, but with respect. She glanced down at her hand, where the gold band rested softly against her skin. The ring had been returned to her, yes, but it was more than that. It was a reminder that life, even after loss, could hold beauty, and that someone could care enough to return what had been lost without expectation. For the first time in many months, Maybelle felt a flicker of hope, a spark of something beyond mere survival. A warmth deeper than any fire. Something unspoken, tender and fragile began to grow between them, a quiet ember glowing in the cold cabin. Outside, the wind whispered across the valley, bending the trees and skimming the snow, but inside, the fire's warmth and the unspoken bond between the widow and the rancher created a small sanctuary. It was a place of safety, of patience, of possibility. As night settled over Dry Hollow, and stars blinked faintly through the clouds, Maybelle allowed herself to imagine a future she had thought impossible, one where survival was not the end, but the beginning. And perhaps, somewhere along that path, love might find its way, tender and unhurried, into a heart that had endured so much. The fire crackled softly, and Thomas Reddick sat back, letting the quiet fill the cabin. Both knew the world outside was harsh, unforgiving, and cold. But in that simple, unremarkable cabin, a small miracle had begun. Two lonely souls had found warmth in each other's presence, and the ember of connection burned brighter with each passing hour. The first light of dawn crept over the ridge, spilling gold and rose across the frost-laden valley. Outside, the snow lay untouched, a pristine blanket that muffled the valley's usual creaks and whispers. Inside the cabin, Maybelle Carter stirred from a restless sleep, the gold ring glinting softly in the pale morning light. It was a small thing, yet it carried weight heavier than any sack of flour or coin. Proof that kindness could reach even the most desolate heart. Thomas Reddick was already awake, standing near the window, his gaze sweeping the frozen fields. He did not speak. His presence was enough, steady and deliberate, like the hands of a clock counting time in a quiet, deliberate rhythm. He turned at her movement, offering a nod, a silent acknowledgement that he had chosen to stay another day, perhaps longer, though neither dared to name the possibility. Breakfast was a quiet affair, modest and unadorned. Flour dumplings and weak coffee, but the simplicity carried a comforting cadence. Words were sparse, yet in each glance and careful gesture, understanding flowed. A language neither had learned in childhood, but both recognized now as vital, intimate, and necessary. "I should ride back soon," Thomas said finally, his voice low, measured. "Supplies wait, and the ranch calls." He did not speak the words of goodbye, for there was no need. Both new departures in Dry Hollow carried weight, but the unspoken tether between them had grown too strong to sever in a single sentence. Mabel's hand hovered over the table, hesitant. Thank you," she whispered, but the words felt insufficient. She wanted to say more, to capture the depth of her gratitude, the trembling hope that had begun to bloom inside her chest. But she lacked the courage, the certainty, the right words for what she felt. Thomas stepped closer, setting his hand lightly on hers. "Don't thank me," he said, soft as the snow outside. "We all do what we must. Some of us get lucky enough to help, and some of us, well, we just get to see what good it can do." She looked up, into eyes steady and unwavering, and felt warmth beyond the fire's reach. It was a subtle ache, an unfamiliar flutter, the quiet recognition that life, even after heartbreak and loss, could offer something tender, unexpected, and real. Then he lifted his hat and stepped toward the door, the wind tugging at his coat. "I'll be back," he said, almost casually, though both knew the gravity of the promise. "Sooner than you expect." She watched him ride off, dust and snow swirling in his wake, and felt something stir deep within, a fragile, luminous thread of hope. The valley seemed less cold, less empty. The wind's bite softened by the thought that some journeys were not taken alone, and some hearts, no matter how weathered, could still find warmth. Hours passed, and Mabel returned to her chores, each movement lighter, her steps steadier. The cabin felt different, infused with a quiet optimism, as if the walls themselves had absorbed a fragment of the morning's promise. She paused often, glancing out the window, imagining him riding through the snowy valley, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine more than survival. Perhaps, she thought, life could offer companionship, and perhaps, in the quiet unfolding of days and deeds, hearts could mend, warmth could return, and love, patient, tender, and enduring, could find its way into even the coldest corners of the world. The sun climbed higher, and the valley shimmered with frost and promise. And somewhere down the winding trail, a rancher rode toward home, unaware yet that he had left a spark behind, one that might grow into something neither he nor the widow had dared hope for, but both would come to cherish as the story unfolded. The valley of Dry Hollow held its breath as afternoon light filtered through the heavy boughs of a solitary willow, its long tendrils brushing the snow-covered ground. Mabel Carter stepped carefully toward it, her boots sinking slightly in the cold powder, leaving delicate impressions that would vanish with the next breeze. She carried a small bundle of kindling, yet her mind wandered far beyond the practical task of firewood. It was here, beneath this willow, that she had come many times in the past, to remember, to grieve, to speak softly to a husband who had left her too soon. The tree had become a witness to her sorrow, a silent companion in the long, lonely winters. Today, it felt different. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, a subtle warmth that seemed to rise from the earth itself, mingling with the soft scent of pine and frost. Thomas Reddick had returned by mid-morning, riding slowly, deliberately, as if aware of the fragile rhythm of her life. He did not speak of his return at first, allowing her to feel the simple assurance of his presence. The quiet togetherness was enough, no words, no gestures, merely a shared space, a recognition that loneliness could be softened, if only temporarily, by a kindred soul. "Mabel," he said finally, his voice low, carrying the gravity of unspoken thoughts, "there's something I need to ask of you." He dismounted carefully, boots crunching in the snow. "I don't know if it's too soon, or if it's presumptuous, but I feel as though we've found something rare in this place. A bond, a trust, something worth honoring." She paused, her heart stirring at the weight of his words. The cold bit at her cheeks, but inside, warmth bloomed, hesitant yet insistent. "Thomas," she began, uncertain how to name the emotions that had grown quietly in the shadows of hardship and survival. He stepped closer beneath the willow, the long branches swaying gently above them, casting delicate patterns of shadow across the snow. "I don't have much to offer," he continued, "no grand promises of wealth or comfort. But I can promise this. I will not leave. I will not walk away from what has begun here, not if you'll allow me to stay." Her fingers brushed the edge of her coat, then hesitated over the gold band resting on her hand. The ring, once sold and now returned, gleamed softly, a symbol not only of the past she had endured, but of the possibility now blooming before her. Her voice faltered, a fragile tremor betraying her emotion. "I don't know what to say. I've lived so long in fear of disappointment, of loss. I've learned to expect nothing. And yet, he said gently, sometimes life surprises us. Sometimes the smallest acts, a returned ring, a shared meal, a quiet day in the snow, can grow into something worth holding onto." She looked into his eyes, steady and sincere, and felt a flicker of something she had not dared hope for: trust, and perhaps, the tender beginnings of love. It was unspoken, a delicate thread woven between them beneath the quiet willow, fragile yet luminous against the stark winter landscape. The wind whispered softly through the branches, and snow fell in gentle flakes, each one catching the light like tiny sparks of promise. In that moment, Maybelle Carter allowed herself to imagine a life that could be different, a life with warmth and laughter, companionship and care, a love not rushed but earned through quiet understanding and shared hardship. Thomas extended his hand, simple and steady. "Stay with me," he said softly, "if only for a while. Let's see where this path leads." And beneath the willow, in the quiet hush of a valley softened by snow, Maybelle placed her hand in his, feeling for the first time in years that the future, though uncertain, might hold more than survival. It might hold love. The sky darkened suddenly, clouds rolling in from the distant ridge like a tide of gray and silver. By late afternoon, the wind had grown sharper, whipping across Dry Hollow with a fierce insistence that rattled windows and tugged at loose shingles. Snow began to fall, first in delicate flakes that kissed the frozen ground, then in thick, blinding sheets that swallowed the valley in a muted white haze. Inside her cabin, Maybelle Carter moved carefully, stacking firewood with hands stiff from cold. The warmth from the hearth did little to stave off the creeping chill that found every corner, every seam, every bone. She paused, glancing through the frost-streaked window at the swirling storm outside, a shiver running through her. Life had grown precarious again, as it often did when winter's fury reminded her that survival was a daily victory. The door creaked open before she could finish her thought, and there he was. Thomas Reddick, his coat caked with snow, boots thick with frozen slush, hair damp and frost-tipped. His presence was a quiet shock of relief, a beacon against the storm raging beyond the walls. "Thomas," she exclaimed, moving toward him instinctively, worry pressing into her chest. "You shouldn't have." "I couldn't stay out there," he interrupted gently, shaking snow from his shoulders. "The storm came up faster than I expected, and I couldn't leave you alone with it." He stepped inside, closing the door against the howl of the wind. The cabin seemed impossibly small against the fury of the blizzard, yet in that confinement, warmth gathered, not just from the fire, but from the shared presence, the quiet reassurance that neither would face the storm alone. Maybelle's hands trembled slightly as she set another log on the hearth. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice soft as snow falling outside. "You've already given so much. Why do you stay?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Because some things are worth more than pride, or distance, or fear. You are worth it." The words fell into the room like a gentle promise, and Maybelle felt her chest loosen, the icy grip of loneliness retreating just slightly. She realized that this man, this quiet, steadfast presence, had become more than a helper, more than a companion through hardship. He had become a lifeline, a reminder that hope could still exist even in the bleakest winter. Hours passed as the storm raged, snow piling higher outside, wind moaning against the cabin walls. They worked together, stoking fires, preparing simple meals, ensuring the animals outside were secure. Words were sparse, but each glance, each gesture carried a language of care, understanding, and unspoken connection. As night deepened, the storm's fury began to wane, leaving the valley hushed and silvered under a thick layer of snow. Outside, the world seemed still, transformed into a blank canvas where hardship had been painted and survival had endured. Mabel looked at Thomas then, the glow of firelight dancing across his features, warmth radiating from his presence more than from the hearth. She felt something tender, fragile, and real, the embers of love beginning to kindle where there had once been only loss. And in the quiet aftermath of the blizzard, she understood the mercy it had brought. Not just snow, not just cold, but the clarity that some souls are meant to find each other amidst the storms of life. The winter could rage, the world could turn harsh, but for now, in that small cabin, two hearts had discovered a sanctuary, and perhaps a beginning. The morning light spilled gently across Dry Hollow, soft and golden, brushing the thick blanket of snow that stretched across the valley like a sleeping quilt. The world felt transformed, silent and pristine, as though the storm had washed away not only the footprints in the snow, but the heaviness that had clung to the hearts of those who lived here. Inside the cabin, Mabel Carter moved slowly, savoring the warmth of the fire and the soft presence of Thomas Reddick beside her. He had spent the night tending the hearth, ensuring the cabin remained safe and warm, and now, in the pale morning glow, he looked almost otherworldly, steadfast, calm, and entirely real. "Morning," she whispered, a soft smile touching her lips, the first genuine one she had allowed herself in weeks. "Morning," he replied, voice low and steady, carrying the kind of quiet assurance that made the snowed-in world outside feel distant, irrelevant. The cabin smelled of coffee and the faint remnants of last night's meal. They moved with ease, a silent rhythm formed through shared labor and subtle familiarity. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. Life was fragile, the valley could turn harsh at any moment, and yet, even in hardship, moments of beauty and grace could be found. Mabel paused by the window, looking out across the snow-drenched hills. Each branch sparkled with frost, each rooftop glimmered in the soft sunlight. She felt a sense of wonder she hadn't known she could feel, a quiet awe at survival, at the resilience of both the land and the people who inhabited it. Thomas came to stand beside her, his presence solid and grounding. "The valley looks different today," he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "Like it's been renewed." She turned to him, eyes meeting his steady gaze. "It feels different," she admitted. "And I feel different too." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and held them. "That's the storm's gift," he said. "Sometimes it takes the harshest weather to remind us what's worth holding onto, and who." Her fingers brushed the gold band on her hand, returned to her after the desperation that had forced its sale. Now it was not simply a symbol of the past, but of endurance, kindness, and the quiet beginnings of a future she had not dared imagine. "Thomas," she whispered, hesitant, fragile, yet certain in a way she had not been for years, "thank you. For staying, for helping, for everything." He took her hand in his, the warmth from their touch stronger than any fire. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You've survived, and you've kept your heart open despite the world's cruelty. That's the part worth honoring." The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the sparkling snow, and Mabel felt a stirring in her chest, tentative, bright, and full of promise. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope, not just for survival, but for something richer: connection, companionship, and perhaps, love. The world outside was cold and harsh, but in the small cabin, warmth lingered, and in the hearts of the widow and the rancher, an ember of hope had grown steady, steadfast, and alive. The storm had passed, yet its mercy remained, the reminder that even in the bitterest cold, hearts could be thawed, and new beginnings could take root. The valley of Dry Hollow gleamed under the gentle light of morning, soft snow reflecting gold and rose from the sun that had climbed high above the ridges. The storm had passed entirely, leaving a world washed clean, every branch heavy with frost, every rooftop sparkling in the quiet brilliance of winter's mercy. Inside her cabin, Maybelle Carter moved with calm purpose, her hands steady for the first time in many weeks. The gold band on her finger glinted faintly, catching the sunlight as she lifted her hand to adjust the shawl around her shoulders. It had been returned to her, yes, but it carried more than metal and memory. It carried the weight of a promise, of kindness, and of hope that had taken root in the coldest winter of her life. Thomas Reddick stood nearby, silent yet fully present, as if the cabin and its occupant were a world he had chosen to protect. His coat, dusted with the remaining snow from last night's storm, hung heavy across his shoulders, but the weight of it seemed insignificant against the gravity of the moment. Maybelle turned toward him, eyes shining. I don't know if I can ever thank you enough," she said softly. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with something she had not felt in a long time: gratitude, recognition, and the fragile stirrings of love. Thomas stepped closer, the sunlight catching the edges of his profile, highlighting the gentle strength of a man who had lived through hardships and yet carried the courage to offer kindness without hesitation. "No thanks needed," he said quietly. "You've survived. You've endured. That is the true testament of strength. And now," his voice softened, carrying a promise beneath it, "now it's time to live, to hope, to let the future unfold." Maybelle felt the weight of the years of struggle lift, if only slightly, as the warmth of his words settled into her heart. The cabin, the valley, even the cold and snow outside, they all seemed lighter, softened by the presence of connection and the spark of trust between them. She looked down at the ring once more, the simple gold band now more than a symbol of the past. It was a testament to endurance, resilience, and the quiet miracles that can appear when hearts remain open. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her hand toward Thomas. "I don't need to live in the past anymore," she whispered. I think I'm ready for the future." He took her hand gently, his fingers closing around hers, and for a moment the world fell away. No snow, no wind, no hardship, only the small, enduring truth that in a world often cruel, hearts could still find each other, and love could begin quietly, persistently, and purely. Together, they stepped toward the door, toward the valley washed bright and new by the morning sun. The snow crunched softly beneath their boots, the air crisp and alive with the scent of pine and frost. And as they walked side by side, the ring on Maybelle's finger caught the light once more, a symbol of the journey they had endured, the kindness they had shared, and the hope they now carried into the days ahead. The wind whispered softly through Dry Hollow, not with sorrow, but with a gentle promise. Life could be harsh, winters could be long, but hearts that dared to remain open could still find warmth, connection, and love. And for Maybelle Carter and Thomas Reddick, the future was no longer a thing to fear. It was a story waiting to be written, together, beneath the wide, forgiving sky of the western frontier.